Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. We are both a floor wax and a dessert topping. And on that theme of versatility in all things, we are bringing back our go-to pundit extraordinaire, opiner par excellence. And as I was calling him this morning when I changed the time on him yet again for this podcast, the Hillbilly Mensch. So, Chris Stirewalt, welcome back to the Remnant. This is like your 400th episode or something like that.
We're beyond jackets now. We're beyond jackets now. And I have to tell you, I had such a good time when you were away, talking about hillbillies. When I took over the Remnant,
I didn't talk about that, but that was a great episode. You did. I listened to it.
Totally great, totally interesting. Hillbillies in the Mist. It was good. So we repurposed your cosmopolitan elite product for the simple, good working people of the earth.
My only complaint about that was I want to get that guy on the Remnant, and then you got him on the Remnant. So
he's great, and I'm blanking on his name right now, and I'm really sorry. But Austin is his middle name. And
Austin Taylor?
Yeah. The Atlantic, after I don't know how long ago they did Kevin Williamson dirty, but the Atlantic is doing a surprising amount of good, interesting stuff. I am consistently surprised by how much heterodox and interesting stuff I'm seeing in the Atlantic these days.
No, I agree about the Atlantic. The thing about the Atlantic is, it's a frustration. It's sort of like my argument about The Simpsons back in the glory days, which was that they were not conservative in the slightest, but they took shots wherever there were false pieties in the culture, and so that meant you're going to get, even if it was 60-40 liberal, that was 38% more conservatives got than they got anywhere else, which was just close to equal time. And so the Atlantic is pretty studious about this sort of America's, public forum, public square kind of thing. And so I find it easier to forgive the stuff that infuriates me because I know there's a theme to the pudding, even though I kind of like it when magazines have a little bit more of a coherent voice, not totally monotone or anything, but like a little more room for surprises.
You and I are in, as you would say, violent agreement on what the job of a journalist is, which is to tell the truth as they see it and not be a vassal to a party or a politician. But one of the other things that a journalist ought to do is be interesting. And the orthodoxy, and I think we saw this at NPR, we were seeing it at NPR. I think it happened to the New Yorker. I think it happens a lot of places on the right as well. Orthodoxy is boring, right? When you have speaking of The Simpsons, the dome, the hard bubble over that circumscribes your worldview. What are the topics we can talk about? What are the topics we can't talk about? Other than being biased and misleading, it's boring. It's just tedious when you read the article, you begin the piece and you go, I could write it from here. I already know everything that's going to be in this piece. That's not good journalism because it's boring.
So, but you did remind me of, I was taking mental notes. I don't really, I wish I could be that kind of person who actually took notes. In real life, it has been a big source of problems for me. You know how many times I have to create a new password? I can't even begin to tell you. Anyway, so you violated a couple at least one very small intellectual nitpick. And where else but this podcast is there room to dilate on such things? You brought up What's the Matter with Kansas, the Thomas Frank book, which I did not like. In your podcast with the to be named later guy, and you did not name check What's the Matter with Kansas was named after. Thomas Frank did not invent the phrase "What's the Matter with Kansas." It was William Allen White, the reformer Republican newspaper man from Kansas.
Yes.
And so it bothers me because I'll often hear people say Thomas Frank came up with wrote a book called, which he called "What's the Matter with Kansas," as if he came up with that. Like at least when I talk about Suicide of the West, I will say as an homage, I will mention James Burnham had the title first and that kind of thing.
Which of us could more easily reach out and touch a volume of William Allen White's writings?
Oh, see, this is a cider in your ear moment. Clearly, you have one nearby.
Right. I'm just saying. I'm out here taking a backseat to no one in my.
You wrote the book on populism, the history of American populism. So, like, I was like, okay, he's going to go there.
I knew that. I did not know that. I'm just standing up for my William Allen Whiteness.
I know. Sometimes you have to wait for the other cufflink to drop, right? And I was just waiting for you to do that. Yes. And I invented that phrase because that's not a phrase. But the other thing, which I don't know if we've ever talked about, is Christopher Lasch writes about this a bunch in, I can't remember which book, but The Nation ran a series of articles I think it was called In These United States. And it was all about what retrograde, backward, podunk dwelling goobers flyover country was long before we had planes to fly over it. And so I mean, like this is a great tradition in American intellectual life on the left is to pee from a great height on lesser Americans that they don't understand why they don't want to go to their salon. Anyway, we're rambling.
And I will just say before we stop rambling, his name is Tyler Austin Harper. I looked it up. That is the name of the writer at The Atlantic, and I apologize, Tyler Austin Harper. He's very good.
See, like if you had told me those were the names of the Jonas Brothers, I might believe you.
Yeah, and it definitely also has some serial killer energy. Because that's just how it is.
You know why? Fun fact. You know why? The people is sort of in a sort of Tucker Carlson Time Life books kind of way. People say it's no coincidence, dismissed as coincidence that all these assassins have three names. You know why they have three names?
Why?
Because by standard law enforcement policy, you give the full name, right? It's not, people didn't necessarily call him Lee Harvey Oswald, right? It's that when they announced his arrest, they announced that they had arrested one Lee Harvey Oswald in part to spare poor Lee Cleophas Oswald,
artist hit,
a mob coming to his house and killing him.
Artist hit, yes. That's right. Very, very, very fair to Cleophas. Clee to his friends.
All right, so here we go. If we had been recording this a day ago, 2 days ago, I would have said it's looking like things are improving for Joe Biden. Trends, polls, words to that effect. But there's a recent Bloomberg poll which seems to suggest that at least in the battleground states, Trump's gain is widening. Now, again, snapshot in time, all those other homespun things that are sewn on pillows. What is your sense of the race at this moment, at the presidential level?
Well, that may be true. That poll may be accidentally correct, but of course, Bloomberg's polling is just trash.
Is that true?
They partnered with, I believe, the Morning Consult polling, which is junk, and it's a real disappointment because Bloomberg has the resources and they have had an interest in doing good polling, and Morning Consult I didn't realize the Morning Consult connection because, like Bloomberg, if you go to the Bloomberg offices in New York, there's so many free snacks. You would just think that they could afford, great polling too. Yeah, and they can, and they should, but and nobody cares about my complaints about polling, but the cheap polling is like the cheap snacks, right? So we have a recent high quality battleground state poll from the bipartisan team that does Fox News's polling, and that jibes with other polls that basically say Trump is ahead. The race is Biden's best swing states Wisconsin pretty consistently is his best swing state. Trump, not surprisingly. Now, and this is where it's interesting, and I wrote about this for the Dispatch, which is right now, Trump's best state is Nevada in swing state, in an average of, and I would commend, by the way, to everyone, there's my friends at Decision Desk HQ, my corporate partners at The Hill have a good new poll average aggregator. DDHQ is great, and it's a good new aggregator. I recommend it. I'm using it. They keep the polls in for longer and then weight them down as they go. So the poll never goes out. One of the problems with poll averages, cheap polls push out good polls. So a Morning Consult or a Rasmussen Reports or a YouGov, a junk poll, those are going to be at higher frequency because they're cheaper to do. Online polls and robodial polls are going to happen at a higher frequency than good polls. So what happens if your average is just the 5 most recent polls? Junk is going to push out high quality polls all the time. What the Decision Desk HQ guys do, guys and gals, is they never take them all the way out. Just as they get older, the weight goes down in the average. They don't weight them on any other thing except for recency. And it's really helpful and it's really useful. So when you look at, and my point in the piece was, in the average, Biden is doing worst in Nevada. Now, Nevada was his second best swing state in 2020. He's doing worse in Nevada than he is in North Carolina. In Nevada, no Republican candidate has won Nevada since 2020 or since 2004.
Okay, those are different dates.
Those are different dates. So for 20 years, no Republican has won there. In North Carolina, a Democrat has won once since the 70s, and that was Obama's very fluky win in 2008.
And of course, obviously, we're just talking about presidential candidates here, not Senate or
right. And on the Senate level,
right.
Democrats are dominant in Nevada, and Republicans are dominant in North Carolina. Their House delegate, North Carolina is a swing state. It's closely contested. No question about it. They have a 50-50 House delegation. They have a Democratic governor. I'm not saying that North Carolina is a pure red state or that Nevada is a pure blue state. But what I am saying, and what is really important to remember when we talk about these swing states, if Donald Trump wins Nevada, he will also win. He will also win Pennsylvania. He'll also win Wisconsin. He's also going to win North Carolina and Georgia and Arizona. These states have, if we're just crushing people with political minutia, the Cook Political Report long ago came up with the PVI, Partisan Vote Index. How much more or less Republican or Democratic is a state or a district than the country as a whole? These especially in a rematch election, we can expect that these states are going to hew pretty closely to their partisan identification. We just had a primary in Pennsylvania. We're recording this the day after primary in Pennsylvania. More Democrats voted in the primaries in Pennsylvania than Republicans. Why? Because there are more Democrats in Pennsylvania than there are Republicans. And if you look back primary after primary, it's a more Democratic state. So it's a very long way of saying swing state polling is interesting directionally, right? Who's up, who's down, how's it going, what's going on? What the polls can basically tell us is that the states are close. It's a very close election, and Trump has an edge right now, but it's close.
The Pennsylvania primary, which weirdly news networks, in an effort to make ad dollars, did not cover as closely as it covered the Trump trial about paying off a porn actress. I don't know that she's a porn star, by the way.
I don't use that. I don't use that. I do not do that because there doesn't seem much that is ethereal or heavenly about the life of Stormy Daniels.
Yeah, Fair. So it didn't get much coverage, but then so I was surprised to learn this morning. Nikki Haley in a closed primary, right? So this doesn't mean you got crossover Democrats and independents. Got like 80,000 votes or something like that, or 18% of the vote, something like that.
Yeah, she got.
Do I have that right?
Yeah, she got 17% of the vote or something. And Biden lost 6% to discount liquor heir Dean Phillips, but it is significant. So
normally we would say, oh, these are just Democrats voting against Biden, all that kind of stuff. That doesn't necessarily apply here unless people like way in advance change their registration or something like that. So you've been a little more poo-pooey, I have to say, on the whole idea that it's transitive adjective I ascribe to you, or something like that. Anyway, you have poo-pooed a bit. You've peed in the cornflakes of those who have asserted that the Nikki Haley turnout has repercussions for the general election. And you're not alone on this. Kornacki and other people I respect have made similar points. But it does seem to me like this surprise, as someone who wants the Nikki Haley thing to be significant, I was still surprised that this happened, because it seemed to me like this shouldn't happen given that it was a closed primary. How should we think about the Nikki Haley thing?
So my poo-pooishness is not absolute. It's not that it doesn't matter. It's that we should be very circumspect when we look at, okay, out of that share of voters, how many of them really will vote for Trump? How many of them will really will write in Barry Goldwater? And how many of them will really vote for Joe Biden? Right? How does that break down? And a lot of them will vote for Donald Trump, right? A lot of those people will still end up voting for Donald Trump. We look at somebody like Bill Barr, who went out and made the strongest possible kind of denunciation of Donald Trump as unfit for command, and gave an insider's account, wrote a book, did all that stuff. And then what did Bill Barr say? Well, I'm still voting for him because he's better than Biden. There are some of those people in the 16%. And one thing for reference, there were 942,314 Republican votes for president in this primary.
Mm-hmm.
The only other statewide race, the only other significant race this year in Pennsylvania is the race for attorney general. And it's a sleeper, right? It will be a hot general election. Pennsylvania has a really powerful attorney general's office. That's how Josh Shapiro became a big name statewide. It's a long stepping stone to the governorship in Pennsylvania, even more than in other states. There were, 80,000 more votes in the presidential than there were in the attorney general. So there isn't evidence that people were turning out in large numbers for another race, and while they were there said, oh, while I'm here, I guess Haley. So part of the reason I think that the Trump trial is significant is for that, let's say 16%. And I think that's probably pretty indicative nationally, 16-20% of Republicans, or people who would typically vote Republican nationally, really don't want Donald Trump. There's, I think the old, what we've seen holds, which is there's a third of the Republican Party that is gaga for Donald Trump. They love him. They love him. They love him. There's 20% that hate him. And then the rest of the party just wants to beat Democrats, right? The rest of the party is not hardcore MAGA. Maybe they're anti-Trump sometimes. Maybe they're concerned about Trump sometimes, but they just are partisans and they just want to win. Of that 20%, the task for Biden is he needs their votes in a lot of places, right? He needs to get a quarter of those people or a third of those people to actually say, yeah, I'm going to do the hard thing. I'm going to vote for the Democrat here because, and we see this from the recent Gallup numbers on enthusiasm. This presidential election right now is on track to have lower turnout than 2020, but higher turnout than 2016, right? And that is really tough for Democrats because Biden's bonus, Biden's margin came in that extra bit, right? That extra bit that turned out that made the difference for Biden. And that's what made typically Republican states like Georgia and Arizona. That's what put North Carolina in play, the little splurp at the end. In an election, I think this is going to look a lot like the 2012 election in terms of turnout. It's not going to be low turnout, but it's not going to be the historically high turnout that we saw in 2020. And that means that for Biden, they're thinking about every single Nikki Haley, each of the 16% of Pennsylvania Republican primary voters, the Biden campaign is going to spend a lot of time thinking about. And what they're going to do is remind them a lot in Pennsylvania, and which is the most important of the swing states. They're going to remind them a lot about what a cad and a cur Donald Trump is.
All right, let's move off cephology for just a moment. And since you brought him up, I have no expectation. I do not condemn Bill Barr for not saying I'm endorsing Joe Biden. I'm not condemning Bill Barr even for, in the sanctity of the voting booth, voting for Donald Trump. Right? Like, people can vote however the hell they want, right? Why would you go on TV knowing that they're going to play 10 clips of you talking about what a disaster he is, how a danger to the country he is, how he's going to destroy the country, destroy the White House, destroy conservatism, destroy the Republican Party, that he's an immoral chaos agent, yada, yada, yada. And they're going to play those clips before they ask you the question, and then they're going to play the clips after you answer the question. Why not go on TV? Just say, yeah, I'm done talking about this. I had my say in my book. Bill Barr, it's not like he's going to be a attorney general ever again, right? It's not like he's going to run for office ever again. Why can't I don't get, like, I'm a little frustrated by John Kelly not saying something more, but he's had his say. Now he's like, I'm done, right? What is the argument for what do you think for what Barr is doing?
I do not know. Mike Pence has taken the hard way, right? Mike Pence has taken the hardest way possible, which is to say, and to be clear, he raised his hand and he said, and to be clear, I'm not voting for this person. And that the amazing thing about Mike Pence, of course, is he's so Mike Pence that he can't even get strange new respect. The left-leaning media outlets are like, oh, Mike Pence. And they're like, does he still believe all the things that, yeah, I guess he does. Okay, fine. No, we can't lionize Mike Pence. He is not suitable for strange new respect because he apparently means the other things that he says. Why Barr felt it incumbent on him to further state an opinion, I do not know. But I was caught. I was in a hotel, and as it happened, watching Heaven Be Merciful to Me, real time with Bill Maher. He had on his panel a public television correspondent and John Meacham. And John Meacham made an explanation about why Donald Trump was unsuitable, because he violates the Constitution, because he is a threat to democracy, because of all of those things. And they had this conversation. And I thought, if I was a Republican and I heard this conversation, and no one at any point said, now, obviously, Joe Biden regularly violates the Constitution. Obviously, Joe Biden is diminishing the constitutional order by trying to forgive student loans or trying to any host of things. What's going on at the Federal Trade Commission. There are a lot of low-grade burns that are happening to the constitutional order under the Biden administration. That's definitely the case. What the correct, not correct, what the persuasive thing to say would be is, I understand if you want to get to those Haley voters in Pennsylvania, you say, I understand that Joe Biden is not a fiercely, he is not the Calvin Coolidge of our time. I get it. He's a problem. I think it was PJ O'Rourke. Was it PJ O'Rourke who said that Hillary Clinton was awful, but within the normal parameters of being awful or something? So the argument that Biden is flawed, but preferable is much more persuasive. And I think I don't know what Bill Barr's thinking, but I think for a lot of Republicans and a lot of conservative Republicans, the anger and the frustration with lots and lots of things is having that effect, right? It's not anti-Trumpism. It's frustration with the free pass for Biden that drives them into the arms of Trump.
So, as you know, we even though you did write a whole book on media criticism, we are both trying not to let media criticism take an outsized role in our brains.
The first refuge of the scoundrel.
That's right. We both agree with most of the complaints about media bias, and we have some additional ones as well. We just don't think that it's productive to inflate the significance and the consequences of it and to get conspiratorial.
It's a cop-out. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And the whataboutism, I mean, my biggest complaint is always like, literally, I can name a half dozen people I've heard say this on Fox or elsewhere back in the Trump days. Trump did X. Trump did something bad that everyone agrees is bad. And then the response is, yeah, but what about the New York Times? I was like, well, the New York Times is not a corporeal human being, and it is not president of the United States. So, like, those are two important distinctions.
Donald Trump clubbed a baby harp seal to death in the Rose Garden. But but did you see that the New York Times claimed that it was an endangered species, and the harp seal has been off the endangered species list since 2000? Check your facts, New York Times.
Right. So again, I agree with all I don't know the percentage. The vast majority of conventional complaints about liberal media bias, I think, are directionally correct, right? And we can argue about severity and whatever, extenuating circumstances. And other things I've been arguing about for a long time. I try to advise people to be against nut picking, taking one crazy person out of the other side and saying, see, this is what they're all like, right? I counsel against recency bias. There are all these things that I have been lecturing people on, and I'm struggling to practice what I preach in the wake of the unfolding stuff on college campuses with the Jews. There's a guy who's been quoted all over the place, go back to Poland.
Ooh.
And the thing is, when you start to think about this, like, go back to Poland is a thing, and usually it's said about Israelis. In fact, I don't know if you remember, but Helen Thomas, former dean of the White House press corps. I used to begin so many speeches. It was my standard opening line was, I'm happier than Helen Thomas at a Hamas rally to be here. Helen Thomas had said Israelis need to go back to Poland and Germany. And that's sort of what facilitated her retirement. But this guy is saying it about American Jews in New York City.
Jeez Louise.
And he's an immigrant from what I can tell. And so, like, go back to your own country is an ugly thing for nativist Americans whose families go back to the Mayflower to say. It is, dare I say, some chutzpah for an immigrant to tell a bunch of Jews who have been in this country since before the founding that they need to go back to Poland, where, by the way, literally half the Jews murdered in the Holocaust were killed in Poland, right? So it is like a trifecta of offensiveness to me. And it gets in my head, right? And then there's these other things, we won 1,000 October 7th, all this kind of stuff. And then I have to go on CNN, where I am a contributor, and I'm not singling them out because it's a problem across the media. The go-to phrase for these people, the go-to descriptors are either anti-war or anti-war protesters or pro-Palestinian protesters. Now, when you are calling for the genocidal destruction of the only Jewish state, that is a call for war. When you cheer every time Iran attacks a country, and you don't call for a ceasefire when Hamas attacks, only when Israel thinks it's going to respond, you are not anti-war. You are anti-Israel fighting back. Right. And when all you're really doing is talking about the destruction of Israel and the Zionists, and no Zionist should be safe anywhere in the world, and that we need to globalize the Intifada, that's not so much pro-Palestinian as it is anti-Israel or anti-Semitic.
Yeah, anti-Israel. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I get frustrated with the what are they like in football? They talk about how like the extra man is for the home team is the boisterous crowd kind of thing.
Yeah. The 12th man.
The 12th man. That's it. Which conveniently, there's this thing called the 12th imam, which is a different thing, but they're kind of converging here. Let's see if we can get them together. Anyway, all I'm bringing up is that I don't want to do media criticism, and I don't want to say that everybody who's at these protests wants to say go back to Poland or there's a woman who's standing in front of a Jewish demonstration in Colombia, and she's basically has a sign up saying Hamas's next target and pointing at the Jews on an American campus. But I can't tolerate this mostly peaceful stuff when they're not actually condemning the non-peaceful people. And so I'm wondering, as the hillbilly mensch, a Gentile in good standing, I'm wondering how you see these things.
Norman Rockwell did a series of paintings on Franklin Roosevelt's, was it the Four Freedoms? Four Freedoms. And which was the foundation basically for the UN Charter. And we know these paintings. They're in our cultural DNA. And the painting to depict the freedom of speech is what? It's a factory worker, a blue collar worker, standing up in a meeting and expressing himself, right? That's the ideal, which is, here is a person who has left his job. I think he even has a union pin on his jacket. He's standing up in the town hall and he is letting his voice be heard. I of course blame the baby boomers. Protest is neither good nor bad. It is a vehicle that people use to achieve ends. We have so lionized protest. The anti-Vietnam War protests hold such an outsized, and you and I, as much younger men, got to observe this during the Iraq War, right? The love of protest, the love of that kind of disruptive stuff is hardwired into the way that we think about these things, or many people, especially on the left, think about things. Do you know what ended the Vietnam War? It was the Democrats took over Congress after Watergate and they cut off funding. But the protest actually helped get Richard Nixon elected. The protests help bomb Cambodia. The protests help put Linebacker 2 in the air, hitting targets in North Vietnam. The way that I assume, I've seen some interviews with the young dummies at these colleges who do not think that they are being anti-Semitic. They do not think that they are being even anti-Israel. They think they're pro-peace. They think that they're pro-whatever. And of course, much like Occupy Wall Street, much like a lot of other things that we can think of, professional agitators, people who are committed anti-Semites, people who are committed to this stuff, join the ranks. And then they're out there. And of course, the correct thing to do at that moment, when you're wasting your parents' money by sleeping in a tent on the quad at Barnard, or you're storming the administration building at Pomona College, is to look at the people around you and say, much like the people on January 6th should have said, I don't think I should be here. I don't think this is the right place for me to be. I think something is happening here that I don't want. And the media's love of the protester, the media's love of it's something to cover, it's a spectacle that you can see, is deeply ingrained. And then when it's reinforced by the bias of the anti-Israel bent of the media, you have that it is an irresistible thing. But I will caution the anti-Israel people, the huge number of whom I'm sure listen to the Remnant frequently. But to the anti-Zionist community, I will say, these people are losing this domestic dispute for you. These protests are keeping the United States aligned with Israel. These protests are going to cost Joe Biden. These protests are going to make it harder for people with moderate ambitions about this to get what they want.
So, but all right. So I didn't get at the heart of my media bias complaint here. I got into a spat with Lulu Garcia Navarro, New York Times journalist, on CNN morning show this week. And it was a continuation from a spat we had on the Chris Wallace show. And I like Lulu, it's fine, but she's representative of a well-established viewpoint in the mainstream media. And the argument that I made that makes her angry is that when you celebrate Hamas, or like literally celebrate Hamas, when you say Hamas is fighting for you, when you say you want to always remember October 7th as a great day and that you want hundreds, no thousands, no tens of thousands more October 7th, when you wave a Hezbollah flag, when you wear Hamas insignia with the little paratrooper, when you cheer when the Houthis or Iran attack Israel, when you say globalize the Intifada and that Zionists everywhere are legitimate targets, where you put it down on paper. That's what the Students for Justice in Palestine, on paper, they say it out loud, that Jews basically everywhere are, Zionists everywhere are legitimate, and there's no distinction between civilian and military. You are pro-terrorism. Like, it's not very complicated to me.
Look, I think the anti-Semitism stuff, particularly Passover, is a big issue. It's a legitimate issue to talk about. It's a serious issue, and I think there's a lot of anti-Semitic stuff going on out there. But when you're saying you're Hamas, when you're praising Hamas, when you're praising Hezbollah, when you're saying you're going to globalize the Intifada.
Excuse me, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but
I'm going to finish my point. It means you're pro-terrorist. If you are celebrating Hamas, you're a pro-terrorist.
I'm not disputing that. What I'm saying.
That's my point.
And I know everyone's is scalded by the war on terror stuff, and they don't, saying someone's pro-terrorism sounds like a terrible thing to say. But if you celebrate and endorse the actions of terrorist groups, I don't know why it's unfair, right? And the recognition of this is completely missing in the media coverage. And what offends me about it is, like, I condemn and attack and denounce anti-Semitism and bigotry on the right quite often because it's the right thing to do. Maybe I don't do it enough, but I think my record's pretty good on it. That's not the point. The point is that while you should do it because it's the right thing to do, the media obsesses with asking Republicans to condemn every bad thing Donald Trump says, condemn Nick Fuentes, condemn Marjorie Taylor Greene, condemn Paul Gosar and all this kind of stuff. And we are not seeing that standard applied to people saying gas the Jews. And that seems like a significant double standard.
Yeah.
I'm just going to put it out there.
Yeah. The situational foreign policy realism. So if you want to take the position that Israel is a colonizer state, there's a shorthand, but basically that Israel is part of the colonial oppression of the West, of the afflicted peoples of the Middle East. If that's your position, and you then rationalize why terror attacks are understandable, right? If you're in the business of excusing October 7th, if you're in the business of saying, well, this is bound to happen, what should Israel do? Should Israel leave? Should they go back to Poland, as some people say that they do? Well, that's not very realistic either, right? If we're making realistic kinds of excuses for people who rape and murder, who go to a music festival and slaughter, people who take and sexually assault hostages, children, if we are coming up with rationalizations for that, why then do we assume? But for Israel, we don't expect Israel to do what would then be realistic for Israel to do. And the double standard is Israel should be held to a higher standard than Hamas because Israel is a Western, basically a Western state. They're a modern, advanced, democratic, pluralistic. That's what they are. That's what they aspire to, and they should be held to a higher standard. But the idea, the infantilization of the Palestinians as helpless, and they can't help themselves. This is just how it is. But then not to say, well, what do you think the people in Israel would want? How do you think they would respond? They did not draft the Balfour Accord. They did not come up with the partition of Palestine. They did not do that. That was 70, 80 years ago. That was not them. They live there now. They have concerns now for their families and their safety and all of that stuff. And the that infantilization of the Palestinians and the double standard for Israel comes back again and again and again. And to go back to the Vietnam analogy, it is a trope. It always seems to be with us when the media talks about this stuff.
So we kind of skipped Capitol Hill intrigue.
Yeah. What's Mike Johnson?
All right. So my take has been, and I hate having to make predictions, but the Wallace Show makes me do a prediction every time I'm on. And I predicted that the attempts to oust Johnson would fail a couple of weeks ago. It then looked like that prediction was getting dicey for a little while, but now I think it's on solid footing. So I guess the question is, do you think we can do this John McLaughlin style?
Wrong.
Mike Johnson will be the Speaker of the House until the next election. True or false?
McLaughlin would not have let me do this, but I'm going to equivocate. Mike Johnson is very careful. So before he jammed the Freedom Caucus on foreign aid, what did he do? He went to Mar-a-Lago and he gave Donald Trump what Donald Trump wanted, which was a kind of tacit promise that he was on board with helping Trump try to steal the 2024 election if need be, right? He went down and they had this weirdo press conference, and Johnson talked about how these migrants from Central America were being let into the country so that they could vote. That's not what's up, right? That's the and just to clarify, voter fraud is real. It happens. It will happen. It happened in the 2020 election. It will happen in the 2024 election, but not that much, right? Hundreds. There will be potentially hundreds of illegal ballots that are cast in the 2024 election. But no, there
and
are
they
not
might break
500
down something like 50-50 for Republicans versus Democrats,
right.
too.
The last instance that we have in a general election where voter fraud was a material consideration was on behalf of a Republican candidate to try to steal a House race in North Carolina. So Johnson goes down and basically is saying, and remember, Johnson got his job because he made his bones in the MAGA community by being the leader. He came up with the totally cockamamie idea that people could sue Pennsylvania for how people could sue to block Pennsylvania's electoral votes from being counted because it was interfering with their due process rights or their franchise in other states because of the way Pennsylvania conducted its elections. Total hogwash, right? Pennsylvania can conduct its elections however Pennsylvania conducts its elections. Texas can conduct its elections however it conducts its elections. But that was the phony baloney lawsuit, by the way, that Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise and other Republicans signed on to for the very reason that they knew it could not work and would not work, right? So it's like, oh, great. Fine. Yeah. I'm signing on to this letter and this amicus in support of this cockamamie lawsuit because then I can say I did something. How much did Johnson really believe it? How much did he not really believe it? But the important thing is he went back to Trump and remade his bones. He said, I'm still here with you in this election tomfoolery. So he does that and then jams the Freedom Caucus. He gets Trump's blessing. And then he goes and jams the Freedom Caucus. Now Johnson is getting strange new respect, right? There's a big piece, speaking of the Atlantic, there's a big piece in the Atlantic about, maybe Johnson, maybe Johnson, I don't know. Meantime, first it was just Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is kryptonite to coalitions, right? Mm-hmm. She is just, if you can get bounced out of the Freedom Caucus, you can get bounced out of anything. The good news for Johnson is that Marjorie Taylor Greene is his leading opponent, right? Short of Lauren Boebert, there's nobody worse that you could have. There's nobody better that you could have gunning for you in the Republican conference.
Paul Gosar, maybe.
Well, but so gradually so here comes Thomas Massie, who is whatever anybody thinks about Thomas Massie, I believe he believes the things that he says he believes, right? I don't think Thomas Massie is making it up. And then comes Gosar. So now they had 3 and 3 is enough. But then they hold themselves in abeyance. And part of the reason they're holding themselves in abeyance is Democrats have made it clear, yeah, we'll keep him. He just did the thing. He made a deal with us and he kept the deal. He put these aid packages on the floor. They passed the Senate, bang, bang, and we got what we wanted. The question is, if there is a motion to vacate, at whatever point that might come, first question is, do Democrats still say, yeah, we're still good for it. We don't want this year. Or after they come back from recess, have Democrats thought, no, actually, it would be really bad for Republicans to have this go on right now. Maybe we're just going to let it go. And maybe enough Democrats come up with their rationale for why, yeah, before we might have done it, but now we're not going to do it. Now we're not going to save him. So there's that part. The other part is this, and I have talked to members and I have talked to staffers who are unambiguous about this. If there's a motion to vacate, there is a real possibility that more members will quit on the Republican side and just give the House to the Democrats. The two McLaughlin questions. One, will there be a successful motion to vacate? That's one question. The other question is, will enough Republicans, and I'm not going to name any names, but are there enough Republicans in the House who are so sick of it, who hate it so much, who are so exhausted by all of it, that they do what Mike Gallagher did and others have done and say, Ken Buck, you know what? I'm not sticking around for this. And the Republican margin is so tiny that if just 3 or 2 said, I'm done, have fun with the Democrats. I think that's a more significant possibility than many people understand.
That's fair. I mean, I guess the way I could have, not anticipating your riot of nuance, is
which is the name of my emo band. That is correct.
Will the Republicans oust Mike Johnson? And that's one possibility. And another is like, will Mike Johnson lose the job? Which points to the other possibility. I do have a question because I'm very excited about this. I am going to be on the I'm a big fan of the London Telegraph's Ukraine, the latest podcast.
It's so good.
And I'm going to be on it tomorrow.
Whoa.
Isn't that cool?
You're highfalutin. You're fancy.
It's the only podcast other than the Conan O'Brien show, which I want to be on, that I could see, or maybe The Rest is History, which is my grind these days. But anyway, enough about my sucking up to British podcast hosts. There's a solo podcast I do for that kind of thing. Anyway, no, there's 4 different packages, right, that Johnson brought out. The schmoes in the Rules Committee didn't want to bring the border one out. So for listeners who don't understand, Rules Committee is basically the Speaker's advance team for legislation. And normally they're supposed to be straight up loyal to whoever the Speaker is. That's why they get the position, because they're the ones who decide how and when and in what form legislation is brought to the floor. So and so, but McCarthy, as part of his deal on the 25th round, agreed to put 3 hotheads from sort of House Freedom Caucus crowd on the Rules Committee. And it was either that or a kidney, and he chose that. So,
and a kidney.
And so, anyway, so Johnson wanted the border security thing brought out, but the Rules Committee guys in this part of the culture of losing stuff said no. So if something doesn't go through the Rules Committee, it can still come to the floor, which it did, but it needs to be passed by a much bigger majority. And that's why it failed. And then people are mad about the Ukraine thing passing because they wanted it tied to the border security thing. But the reason why the border security thing couldn't come out to the House floor in the first place is because the people who were making that argument killed it in utero, essentially, gave it some strontium 90. The question I have is, let's say, who was the hippo with the time machine and the air balloon? Do you remember that cartoon?
I'm sorry. What?
There was a time traveling hippo who would breathe into in the 1970s. I will find it. Let's say they never made the connection between border security and Ukraine, right? Or let's say they actually had passed a border security thing earlier this year, right? Just the connection wasn't there. The Ukraine aid was the only one that didn't get a majority of Republicans. It was close. It was like 112 to 102 or something like that, right? So it was close. But how many of those guys would have been for the Ukraine aid, but for the fact that their voters have been told by Jesse Waters and everybody else that you can't vote for Ukraine aid without getting border security first? So, in other words, how many of them actually agree with giving Ukraine aid, but they just couldn't do it because it was a politically painful vote?
Oh, I don't think the border. I think the answer is none or almost none.
Really? You think you think they were all actually just straight up against the Ukraine aid?
I think that if we had secret ballot in the House, they wouldn't be. But what we have learned, why did Republicans oppose the Langford deal, which would have been, just to point out, the toughest border package, will be Trumpy, will say, ever, of all time. Why did they oppose that? Was it because it wasn't tough enough? Well, yeah, you can make an argument for that, but Trump, as usual, gives the game away because it would be good for Biden. It would be too good for Joe Biden. Because it would be too good for the country, basically, if there was a deal on the border, right? And we were addressing the problem, and Joe Biden could say, look what we did. Donald Trump never got a deal like this. I got a deal like this. We're ramping up enforcement at the border. We're sending the judges. We're increasing security. We're doing all of that stuff. And when Trump said, it would be a gift to Democrats, by the way, I don't know how it can be the great replacement theory of flooding the nation with voters, and it would be a gift to Joe Biden to increase border security.
That's
Whatever.
a good point.
But the opposition to, you mentioned culture of losing. This is the 3D chess culture of losing. We need to not get what we want here, because if we get what we want, it will help. If we get most of what we want, it will help Joe Biden retain the presidency, which will prevent us from getting everything that we want later. When Dear Leader returns and we have our glorious restoration, we will have everything we want on border security. So let's hurt Joe Biden now by keeping the problem as bad as possible. And then we'll get the presidency, and then we'll have it all. So that's that part. The border security, I think the anger at Ukraine, the furious anger at Ukraine, has deep roots on the right. Ukraine, there's a partisan valence to how we see the countries. Syria, like, for example, was for a long time a Democratic favorite. Democrats were Assad, Nancy Pelosi's famous trip to Damascus and that stuff. The Ukrainians were seen as a Democratic friendly place, not a Republican friendly place. Poland, conversely, Republicans have a lot of good feelings about the Poles. Ukraine, less so. So you have the pre-Trump part. And then once you had Trump's first impeachment and that jazz, the anti-Ukraine urge goes up. The aid to Ukraine has become a stand-in. It has become a litmus test among the nationalist right for how do we know that someone is a globalist? How do we know that a person is one of these bad people? And Ukraine has become the litmus test. And I think for the Republicans who voted against Ukraine aid, are there a couple? Look at what happened in the Senate when they brought the package back to the Senate. People who were no before, lots of people who were no before, were yes. There was no border security in the package. They went from no to yes on a package that was less conservative or less Republican. They went to yes. I think in the House, you might have picked up a couple more Republicans, but I think that it has become doctrine on the nationalist right that it's not just that you should not support Ukraine, but that Ukraine is bad and that Ukraine maybe is worse than Russia. Maybe Ukraine is the real problem. And if you listen to Marjorie Taylor Greene, if you listen to the voices in the media that talk about this stuff, the anger that I heard from Republicans about Democrats waving Ukrainian flags on the House floor, this treason, this betrayal, this outrage, they hate Ukraine. And I think the sanctions, the beating that Johnson is going to take, over Ukraine and this package, whether or not it costs him the speakership, whether or not whether the Republicans cede the House, whatever happens, this will be the mark that he will live with the nationalist right for the rest of his career.
I want to say I agree with all of that directionally, right? I agree with the analysis. I don't agree with the views ascribed to the...
Yes, it's stipulate. Yes.
Where I'm just going to have to beg to differ pending further investigation is the scale of it. Insofar as Marjorie Taylor Greene tried to do this zero-out maneuver against Ukraine and got crushed. Many of the people who voted against Ukraine aid when it came up normal voted against Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now, stipulated, Marjorie Taylor Greene is a gargoyle who has this ability to arouse contempt from all 360 points on the ideological spectrum, right? So, like, part of that is an anti-Marjorie Taylor Greene thing. And by the way, just since we're bringing it up, going back to something earlier you said, I think one of the other reasons why Johnson is safe right now is even some crazy Republicans do not want to be the name that comes next in a list after Marjorie Taylor Greene, Paul Gosar, and Thomas Massie. Like, you wouldn't want anyone to say, I was listening to Marjorie Taylor Greene, Paul Gosar, Thomas Massie, and Chris Stirewalt the other day. Right. That is the.
Oh, you don't subscribe to our podcast? It's super edgy.
Yes.
Super edgy.
I mean, that is a sort of a negative Mount Rushmore, a fecal Mount Rushmore that no one wants to be the fourth fecal head on that Mount Rushmore. Right. So like if more people join them, that triumvirate, it's going to be in a big group. So like no one can say they're the fourth. Anyway, that aside, I think in all sincerity that let's not say it's isolationist to let's say it's isolationist to oppose aiding Ukraine, right? I think it's actually more complicated. Isolationism is a very misunderstood and misused term, but just for as a label for this point, right? I don't say it's a bellwether die marker for the isolationists to vote against aid for Ukraine or to be against aid to Ukraine. I don't think of the 112 people, 110 people who voted for it, or whatever the number is, I don't think all of them are isolationists. I think it's probably closer to 60 of them, something like that. Again, you know the Hill much better than I do. But it feels to me like when I hear these people publicly talk about it, and the few people I've talked to privately, they're like, yeah, we set up this thing where we said you can't help Ukraine without protecting our own border first. We've used this, like they care more about the Ukrainian border than they care about our own border thing. So without the border security thing, it's just a very difficult vote for me. But otherwise, I kind of wish, but I don't get I agree with you entirely that Marjorie Taylor Greene is a jackass about this. And that a lot of people agree with her about Ukraine being bad and evil. And there's a cartoon thing about it. I'm wondering about the numbers.
But you nailed it. There were people who voted to make it possible for Ukraine to get the aid and then voted against the aid itself. And the question is, what number of them would have voted for it with the attached border security? I think that number is low. I think that number is very low. I think they wanted aid for Ukraine. I think that the supermajority of the Republican conference wants aid for Ukraine. I think 60%, 70% of the Republican conference in private would say, yeah, we can't let Russia, which is allied with Iran and China, roll a U.S. proxy in Ukraine. That's not, whatever you think of Vladimir Zelensky, whatever you think of Ukraine, I think that's a supermajority of Republicans. My point is, the border measure is itself tainted because it's not HR, was it HR 1, HR 2, but the House version that is, alligators in the moat, whatever it is. So it's bad to do border security in the minds of many Republicans because it helps Biden, and because if we hurt Biden, then we'll get more later. We'll get everything that the one of the most damaging myths that we have lived with in the United States this century is that total victory is possible, right? And that once we have everything, and as we saw with the hilarious calamity of Republicans and Obamacare, once we have everything, then we don't have to deal with the other side at all. We can get everything we want. Oh, well, never mind. The only point on which I disagree with you is I think at this point, even the attachment of border security would not have made it politically possible for people who wanted the aid to go to Ukraine, who have tough primaries, who are bucking for leadership positions within the Republican Study Committee or whatever. Those people, I don't think that would have been sufficient cover for them to vote for it anyway.
All right. I'm going to have our Crackerjack team at the Dispatch investigate this question, and we will get back to you.
Tell Drucker to start counting noses.
All That's what they're doing at Columbia. That's a different thing. But
you, sir, are on fire today. Fire today.
Dr. Stirewalt, thank you so much for being here. We didn't do any pop culture stuff. I apologize. I tried to bait you a couple times, but
well, we get what are all the kids talking about but William Allen White? I mean, what have we done but ride the tsunami, the zeitgeist tsunami for William Allen?
Different than Byron White. Different. There's a lot, But William Allen White, even though we pronounce his middle name, was not in fact an assassin or a serial killer.
That we know of. Who really killed Harding?
Also, just because it occurs to me, you know why we always talk about Florida Man?
Because of their astonishing sunshine laws that
right.
allow, and though I will say, contra Charlie Cook, Florida is also weird. Both things are true.
Yes.
It's not like Florida is a normal state that is only unfairly beset by its open records law. Florida is also wonderfully, delightfully weird because it's 4 states in one, and people do in Florida try to rob convenience stores with alligators.
Right. So just the listeners that don't know what we're talking about, Jeb Bush, praise be upon him, signed the Sunshine Law that basically meant that all police records, police footage, police reports, all that kind of stuff are almost instantaneously available to the press. And so people who are looking for stuff to, the Daily Mail probably has 5 people who are just surfing law enforcement websites waiting to find someone throwing an alligator through a drive-through window that they can write about. It doesn't mean that people in Louisiana aren't throwing alligators through drive-through windows. It just means it's kind of invisible to us. Because that's it. All right, so let's say all 50 states had similar sunshine laws. What would be the biggest producer of crazy person stories?
Per capita?
I think we have to do per capita. Otherwise, it's just California on the scale of it, right? And it might be on the merits anyway. Per capita, which would produce the most Florida man-like stories, regardless of what state they're from, and which would produce the most boring ones?
I mean, as a West Virginian, I feel like I don't know whether I should take my side by saying that we would be number one or whether I should be offended that we would be number one. But I think there's a strong argument that the Appalachian America, West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and then out into the Ozarks and Arkansas would probably produce a decent amount. But I think warm weather, I'd be looking for a place with warm weather and lots of transient population where you have a lot of that going on. There's a lot of mixing of weird people. So I think Florida might still be in the running, but certainly West Virginia would be on the list. Least, I don't know, Delaware. Delaware's pretty boring.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're
Nebraska.
Right. If friggin' there's some weird stuff up in Alaska. I mean, it's just
Alaska. I mean, for sure. Yeah. More caribou related incidents than almost anywhere.
I was just pushing that caribou over the fence, officer. But I will say, if social scientists actually cared about expanding human knowledge, they would come up with a protocol to figure this out, because you can figure out where these police reports are from, like exurb this, this kind of population density, this kind of demographic mix. And then you could sort of come up with a rule of thumb about incidences of these in these kinds of places. So whichever has the most of these kinds of places wins. And so I think you're probably right that Florida would probably still be in the top 3.
Warm weather. And I guess the things I would look for would be climate, and I would look for per capita income. And educational attainment. So you're looking for places that are not highly educated. You're looking for places that have warm weather so people can be outside, being wild more of the year. And so I think that's right. So I can only tell you that in the days of yore, when ships were made of wood and men were made of steel, the Associated Press wire did actually print out, right? There was wire slugs printed out endlessly on a printer in the back of a newsroom with a little bell when there'd be a alert. But then on your monitor, the wire would refresh and the wire slugs would be at the top. And every time the wire would refresh and a story would come across that said, man arrested for lewd conduct at nativity scene, which is a story that actually my friend George Gannon actually got to cover. But every time a story like that would come across, what's the first thing you'd say before you opened it? Come on, Alabama. Come on, Mississippi. I know you're out there, Kentucky. I know Arkansas, you're in the game. Don't be West Virginia.
So I've written about this before. I think in the context of writing about your book, but my dad, who's a longtime newspaper man and editor, it drove him crazy. A lot of aphorisms drove him crazy, but one of them was dog bites man isn't a story, man bites dog is a story. And my dad kept a file
of dog bite stories,
of man biting dog stories that no one would run. And he's like, it's just not true. It's like every newspaper in this country is running stories about people being bitten by dogs every day, in the police blotter or elsewhere. But like, it is really hard to get someone to run one of our features about a man biting a dog, and it happens. And so it's just, it's a thing. So
it goes to show you. It just goes to show you.
Indeed, it does. Dr. Stirewalt, always a pleasure to have you. Obviously, you'll be back, whether you like it or not, and keep fighting the good fight.
Always a pleasure, my friend.
I should say Chris Stirewalt is a colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's like some major poobah at News Nation.
You should watch us on the Hill Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern on News Nation.
There you go. I always forget to plug you because I just assume everybody knows who you are. So there you go. Okay, so Brother Stirewalt has left the studio. Always good to talk to him. Apologies for not identifying him to new listeners, which we always have more new listeners and all that kind of stuff. And apologies to those who find him to be my audio doppelganger. I really don't hear it as much as some people do, but I get it, I guess. There's just no way on an audio thing he can wear like a name tag. And I'm and it's funny. I've noticed this a lot lately. People who use someone else's name in a conversation a lot. Like, I just did this thing for the Skiff about Iran with David French, and several times he would say in the middle, and Jonah. And the weird thing is like in a two-person conversation, it feels weird to me to use someone else's name, but a lot of people do that, and maybe I should do more of that. Then Tim Alberta does that a lot. Every time I have him on, he probably says Jonah like 30 times an episode. I think it's weird, but maybe I should be doing more of that to help differentiate, at least from my audio doppelganger, Chris Stirewalt. I got to head off. We're having board meetings for the Dispatch, and as I said, I'll be on the Telegraph pod. And I'm also going to be on this Australiana podcast put out by the Spectator of Australia. That was a lot of fun. And I'm going to this thing this weekend. I'm speaking at the Word of the South Festival in Tallahassee. I don't know if listeners out there are around or what you do about tickets, but I'm sure there's a website and whatnot. And sounds like it's going to be a fun conversation. And other than that, I'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.